this lecture, I will try to debunk some myths and myth conceptions commonly attributed to Vikings and the Viking Age. Of course, I am limited by time, so I won't be able to discuss absolutely everything. So that is why I picked 10 of what I considered the most relevant myths about the Viking Age, and we will try to explain each and every one of them. And at the end, I also have, let's say, a Christmas bonus, so to speak. Let's start with the allegation that the Vikings were one people or one nation. This is something you often hear, and this is something we should refute. It is a simplistic notion that the Vikings constituted a single monolithic nation. We cannot really speak of nations at all in this period. So when we talk about the Viking Age, we refer to the period between the 8th and the 11th century, and it was a very complex reality, generally dominated by regional identities. Nation states, or at least the core of the nation states in Scandinavia, is to be found a little later. Now, there are a couple of arguments that need to be considered when discussing this this misconception. First of all, we should make a case for linguistic diversity, although, yeah, sure, we can argue that the Vikings spoke Old Norse. That was the language they spoke throughout Scandinavia. However, we can notice, at least beginning with let's say roughly the 9th, 10th century, some differences between two varieties, and those varieties are Old West Norse and Old East Norse. So we do have a bit of a linguistic divergence here, and this is evidenced in runic inscriptions and later in manuscripts, in vernacular manuscripts. So this would challenge the idea of a completely unified language and underscore the regional identities that shaped Viking culture. But even without talking about these linguistic differences, we can still argue that we're not really dealing with one people. Just think of the way everything would have been organized in Scandinavia, especially in this particular area. We have generally isolated communities. The geography of the Scandinavia Peninsula would have enforced these regional communities to take shape. There are also a couple of differences to draw here between, for example, Norway, where because of the mountainous landscape and so on, people indeed would have tended to live quite isolated from one another. And then you have Denmark, which is rather flat and plain, and here we actually have at least according to some sources, the idea of a nation, somewhat of a nation having been built, or at least seeds of it having been planted by Harold Bluetooth in mid 10th century. So the evolutions of the unification would have been different, but generally speaking, at least until mid 10th century, we cannot really speak of one people. This idea that they were one people, this has also been enforced by medieval sources themselves, because when you look at the terms used in medieval sources, it's quite a mess, because we can find terms such as Danes and Norwegians and Northmen, neglecting to differentiate between the specific groups involved. But of course, that is also something to be understood from the perspective of the ones being attacked by Vikings, because they really didn't stop to interview the aggressors, asking them where they come from or what they speak and to whom they have their allegiance. So there has been a tendency in medieval sources as well to present Viking raiders as a single undifferentiated entity, which has long-term fueled this misconception of their unified nationhood. There's also a term in Old Norse used for the language, which is Danskatongu. So this would be the Danish tongue as a common language in Scandinavia, but this does not suggest a singular cultural or political identity. So this whole idea of a nationhood of the Norse-speaking people is something that has been very much drawn into focus in the 19th century with the 19th century romantic nationalism. This era ignited interest in the ancient and medieval past, as well as in Viking heritage. And the tendency was to romanticize this whole image as a unified force embodying a shared Scandinavian identity. And the idealized portrayal often obscured the complex realities of intergroup conflicts, power struggles, and the very fluid nature of alliances that characterized Viking society. So when the Norse decided to go Viking, to go abroad raiding or engaging in pirates activities, they usually attached to a group of people, and they could have come from different regions of Scandinavia. And the essential here was to have like a chieftain, a commander to whom to plead allegiance, and then you would go with him on these raids. But we are not dealing here with some sort of state organized campaigns or anything of the sort. So in Sweden, for example, we have the Geatish Society, which was founded in 1811, focusing very much on this idea of the generalized, romanticized northern world, and it was promoting a unified but inaccurate view of Viking culture. Scandinavian nations, as we conceptualize them today, were in their nascent stages during the Viking Age. That is true, but the conclusion of the nationhood is to be drawn much later in the Middle Ages, or towards the end of the Middle Ages. Allegiances, like I said, were primarily to these local communities. People would have identified themselves with local communities, with chieftains and regional powers, rather than this whole broad, cohesive national identity we tend to talk of today, stemming from the 19th century. So they were not a monolithic nation, but a tapestry of diverse groups bound together by certain cultural threads, yet distinguished by their unique regional identities and motivations and ambitions. There has always been a problem with this term, Viking, by the way. The term is still used today in scholarship, but we should take into account that this is rather has to do with the profession. I'll come to that. Come back to that later. It doesn't really have an ethnic connotation, but at any rate, the term has been kept because it simplifies a very complex reality. The more correct term would be, let's say, Northmen, very generally speaking, so people coming from the north, the Northern Europe, or the Norse speakers, so speakers of the Old Norse language. So we should differentiate between Vikings as this whole general group coming from the north and engaging in the raids, and also in settlements and trading and so on, and this very particular idea of engaging in just one activity, which was that of raiding. At any rate, if you examine the various terms used in the primary sources, you're going to notice their ambiguity. And a very good example for that is the way they're represented in British and Irish sources. So in Irish chronicles, for example, you have two interesting terms, which is the fair foreigners and the dark foreigners. And these have been traditionally interpreted as two distinct groups, ethnic groups, with the fair foreigners being the Norwegians and the dark foreigners being the Danes. However, this has been a skewed interpretation, and it has been demonstrated in recent studies. For example, that was conducted by Claire Downham, that dark actually suggested newer groups, and fair referred to earlier groups. So it was actually a chronological differentiation, and not really an ethnic one. So she proposes that the dark foreigners might specifically identify those under the leadership of the family of Ivar, highlighting the fluidity of these designations. Then we have terms such as Dane and Norwegian, often translated from Latin, frequently appearing as general appellations of Scandinavians rather than specific ethnic identities. And this is also suggested by the fact that authors seem to have a preference for one term or another, and a lot of times they can be used interchangeably. So there wasn't really a clear-cut distinction between these terms, and this is something you can also notice in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, because this is one chronicle that often employs these terms interchangeably when describing the same individuals or groups, really challenging this whole notion of clear national or ethnic distinction. Um, a more common term used to describe like everyone coming from Scandinavia and going raiding on the British Isles is that of heathens, because we are talking about a time frame, so the 8th, 9th century, where when the British Isles would have been Christianized for a very long time. So a good way to draw a distinction between your people and the ones coming from abroad, the foreigners, the Vikings, would be to designate them as being the heathens. So we can say that Viking is quite a vague term to describe Scandinavian culture of the late Iron Age, and lately the term has been rather used to describe people not only going raiding but generally leaving Scandinavia itself. So we often talk nowadays, for example, about the Viking diaspora, and this would be an approach that would avoid imposing modern national categories on a period where cultural interactions and allegiances, fluid allegiances, would have been the norm. So definitely, Vikings did not constitute a homogeneous nation, but rather hailed from very diverse regions across Scandinavia with distinct customs and a lot of political rivalries as well. Yeah, and speaking of professions, first and foremost, Viking was a profession, a summer job, if you will. But then, in extenso, it also meant the people who left, first and foremost, to go raiding and to engage in piracy, but also, well, if you had the chance, you would also settle some lands or engage in trade. And actually, the history of trade between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe is quite a long one. It does not stem from the Viking Age. We also have plenty of evidence of it having taken place in the Bronze Age as well. But besides the Viking raids, we also have a great deal of other professions necessary for a society to function. Actually, most people were not really engaged in Viking activities, but were engaged in very common activities. Most of them were farmers, or fishermen, craftspeople, merchants, shipbuilders was also a very important activity. So these multiple professions constituted the backbone of the social structure. So their lives revolved around subsistence, first and foremost, but then also local trade and, more generally speaking, community life. A relatively small segment of the population participated in Viking expeditions, but when they did, their ventures were often sponsored and supported by the elite class. Would have been chieftains, so regional leaders, wealthy landowners who sought to expand their power, wealth, and influence. And these expeditions were very much appreciated, first and foremost, by young men, because they offered a lot of opportunities for young men seeking upward social mobility, wealth accumulation, or, yeah, generally speaking, a life of adventure. So that would have been the main category group that would have taken part in Viking expeditions. And speaking of Viking, this is actually a term you can also find on runestones. So it's not only a term that stems from later periods when historical research started dealing with the Norse, with the Northmen. We can find the term on runestones as well, but generally it is used either as a noun, meaning expedition, or in a verbal phrase, fara I Viking, so to go Viking, essentially, so to go on a raid. Very rarely you can find the term referring to like the person actually doing that. At any rate, we have in this case as well a very romanticized notion that all Scandinavians would have yearned for this life of raiding, piracy, plundering, exploration, adventure, and so on. Um, it is not true. For many, the practicality and stability of life as someone engaging in farming or in trading activity, or someone taking up some sort of skill, of craftsmanship, was definitely something that would have had greater appeal than all the risks and uncertainties associated with the Viking vocation. It was a very dangerous profession, and this is something also confirmed archaeologically from, for example, the wounds we see to the skeletons, very severe wounds stemming from altercations or conflicts with the peoples they came in contact with. So it was a profession that was pursued by a select few, generally young men, and the broader Scandinavian society would have encompassed a wide array of livelihoods and aspirations. So it's essential to bear in mind the composition of a society in order to avoid this misconception that everyone would have been a Viking in the Viking Age. And the third stereotype is also something that has to do with this whole idea of going Viking as being something that everyone would have desired. The idea of Vikings as being barbarians. So, for example, here when I use the term Vikings, I actually refer to the whole Scandinavian society. At any rate, here you can see in a lot of yeah, well, let's say popular culture, especially in games, as far as I've seen lately, and we'll also have this image of the Norse being presented as uncivilized and uncultured barbarians, and it's also an enduring narrative stemming from, well, on the one hand, of the chronicles perspectives in the Middle Ages, but then also the influence of later historical interpretations, which also needs to be deconstructed to reveal a more balanced and nuanced understanding of Viking culture. So we have the Christian chroniclers, understandably traumatized by what they were experiencing, and they often highlighted the desecration of monasteries, the killing of priests, the plunder of churches, this whole aggression and violence inflicted upon Christian communities. And these accounts are indeed valuable resources, historically speaking, because we don't really have many contemporary sources talking about the Vikings from their own point of view. We rather have the point of view of the enemy, but let's say it's better than nothing. But there is this risk of them being presented very biased. They have one-sided portrayal of Vikings, emphasizing especially their brutality and ruthlessness as invaders, therefore contributing to this whole barbarian stereotype. Nevertheless, we should always keep in mind that we're dealing with the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, so the early Middle Ages, the period between 500 and 1000. Everyone was violent in this period. If you look at let's say the campaigns of Charles the Great, of Charlemagne, you're also going to notice a great deal of violence. So it was, generally speaking, a very violent time to live in. But then again, the Christian chronicles very much focused on this idea of the Vikings being like the worst of the aggressors one could have experienced. For example, we have the letters of Alcuin of York, vividly describing the devastation and terror inflicted by Viking raids on the church of Saint Cuthbert. So that would be the Lindisfarne attack, reinforcing the image of Vikings as being these ruthless and merciless and godless barbarians. And also in the Irish chronicles, you can find well, essentially the same images. We have, for example, the war between the Irish and the foreigners. It was written in the 12th century, and this is a source that very much emphasizes the immense suffering endured by the Irish at the hands of the Vikings, painting a very stark picture of their barbarity and pagan ruthlessness. All right, and then we have fast forward a couple of centuries, we have the Romantic movement again. So at the end of the 18th century, this total captivation by Viking culture also playing a part in perpetuating the stereotype, this time the noble savage stereotype. So Vikings were frequently depicted as these untamed primeval figures possessing innate strengths and qualities and vitality, contrasting with the perceived decadence and over civilization of contemporary European society. So this interpretation, while acknowledging certain aspects of Viking culture, often reinforced this notion of Vikings as being outside of the realm of civilized society. They were seen more positively, but they were again depicted as somebody really living on the fringes of civilization. But this was seen as something to be aspired to. Now, if we look at what the Norse actually did, we're going to notice a lot of sophistication. We're going to notice a lot of contributions in different realms, a lot of technological sophistication, particularly in navigation, in shipbuilding, and craftsmanship. So, first and foremost, they had this enormous ability to construct remarkably durable and seaworthy ships, to navigate vast distances using celestial cues and advanced seafaring techniques, and also create intricate works of art. These are just two examples suggesting that our perception as Vikings being primitive is actually very much a misconception. So, for example, if you look at the archaeological discoveries such as the Oseberg and the Gokstad ships, you are going to notice that they are very well, brilliantly crafted vessels. He was discovered in Norway, and these still stand as testaments to Viking prowess. The Oseberg ship in particular is not only an example for shipbuilding, but also for art, has these ornate carvings and intricate designs. One of the Viking art styles bears the name of this ship, the Oseberg style, and this reveals a high level of craftsmanship that definitely defies the barbarian stereotype. But modern media and films and television series, video games, and popular literature often still perpetuate this barbarian stereotype, portraying them as bloodthirsty hordes driven by the insatiable thirst for conquest and plunder. Yeah, you can argue that these are entertaining representations in the sense that it's definitely more entertaining to present a horde of Viking warriors attacking a village than, to show them engaging in everyday activities. But when doing so, you should also be aware that the complexities of Viking activities and motivations are overlooked, and their significant contributions to trade, exploration, and cultural exchange as well. Speaking about cultural exchange, if you look how much they traveled and how many peoples they interacted with, we can speak of a sort of globalization of la lettre, because they really enforced and encouraged these cultural contacts. And sometimes they did it violently, but many times they did it through trading or just intermingling with whatever peoples they encountered. Let's move on with the blood eagle. The blood eagle has always been this very enduring aspect of Viking culture that is constantly looked at when, trying to draw on this whole image of aggression and violence. It would have been a gruesome execution method purportedly practiced by Vikings, and still standing as a very contentious topic, still shrouded in uncertainty and debate. Now, there are some sources that indeed suggest that this would have been something put into practice, but at the same time, there are a lot of question marks here. So if you look at a couple of sagas, it's not really mentioned that often in sagas, but in the Orkney saga, for example, you can find one example, the blood eagle, and this involves, briefly speaking, the carving the shape of an eagle onto the victim's back, severing their ribs from the spine and pulling their lungs outward to resemble the outstretched wings of an eagle. So something absolutely gruesome and horrific. It is said that it was reserved for enemies in particular who had committed particularly horrendous acts, often functioning as some sort of ritualistic vengeance or sacrifice. And if you look at this picture here, this is a pre-Viking picture from the island of Gotland, the Stora Hammars picture stone. Some suggest that we do have indeed a sacrifice represented on this picture. It is definitely a possibility that something like this could have been done. However, we do have one major problem here, which is that of the other source describing this practice, which is skaldic poetry. So the poetry of the courts of kings and chieftains. Definitely some challenges here in interpretation. The earliest and because they're the earliest, also the most reliable accounts of the blood eagle are found in the skaldic poetry. And this is a sort of poetry that is renowned for its very, very intricate metaphors called kenningar and complex imagery. So, for example, if you look at Knut's Dropa, the Lay of Knud, written by Sigvard Þórðarson, you have a 12th century poem about King Knud mentioning Ivar the Boneless killing King Ella and carving the blood eagle on his back as a vengeance for the killing of his father, the famous Ragnar Lothbrok. And another source would be Regensmál. The date of the poem is a bit disputed. It contains a possible reference to the hero Sigurd carving the blood eagle on Lyngvi, who would have been his father's killer. Interpreting these poems can lead to potential misinterpretations. It is very much possible that the blood eagle was in fact a kenning, a poetic metaphor for a less gruesome practice, or a symbolic representation of a particular form of punishment. We should also take into account that when describing people slain in battles, the image of birds of prey is something occurring all across skaldic poetry. So you have ravens and eagles very much present in this type of poetry. So there is this possibility that poets again wanted to use it as a metaphor, and it was not really meant literally. It was meant to say that someone was slain, and then the birds of prey would come to feast on the corpse. So it's very much possible. And then again, it could also be a potential for Christian propaganda and misinterpretation. It could have been a fabrication, especially if you look at the saga sources. It could have been a fabrication to demonize the Vikings and accentuate their pagan brutality. So this would have been a tool, an image used as a tool to further distance Viking culture from Christian values and to justify then the efforts to convert Scandinavians to Christianity. Archaeologically, we also don't really have any definitive evidence to either confirm or refute the existence of the blood eagle ritual, so the debate very much continues. A couple of years ago, a medical article was actually published. It engaged with the practical possibilities of such a ritual being conducted, and the conclusion of the researchers was that it is indeed possible to conduct such a ritual, but that is not a piece of evidence for it actually taking place. So I would say that it is still a subject of ongoing fascination and scholarly scrutiny, because while we do have some indications in historical accounts about the possibility of such a ritual, it could have also just been a metaphor for like dying in a very horrible way as a result of be either being punished or just dying on a battlefield. Another thing you often hear related to the Old Norse culture is that of women, that women would have had the same rights as men, which is again very, very problematic. This is very much a myth perpetuated by series like Vikings, where we even have this idea of women being able to pursue a career in Viking, in raiding, and also engaging in very actively on the battlefield. There are also, I think, organizations of women warriors, so bands of women warriors under the command of Freya, I think, or something like that. Either way, it is presented as something very present in society, women fighting alongside men and basically doing everything men did. That is, again, a myth. Nevertheless, it is inaccurate to generalize about the experiences of all Viking women because, as usual, you have to consider the vastness of Scandinavia at the time span of the Viking Age. So you should realize that their lives would have varied greatly, both geographically and chronologically. However, the evidence, especially the law codes, suggests that for the majority of women, their primary roles were those of wives and mothers with limited social and legal rights compared to men. So pretty much everything you're going to find in any traditional society. They did nevertheless have certain legal rights, but they were not equal to men in terms of power and social standing. There are laws that granted Norse women more rights than many other ancient and medieval cultures. That is true as well. However, they did not have formal say over major life decisions such as marriage. So, in a marriage, suitors would approach a woman's guardian, and if the guardian agreed, they would settle the terms of marriage, including the bride price and the wedding date, all without the woman's knowledge. And this is something also found linguistically in the term brúðkaup, which is the term for marriage in Icelandic, which is one of them. I think it's old-fashioned today, but definitely a bit of this tradition has been preserved somehow. So the bride's opinion was sometimes sought, but most women just resorted to their fathers for that. This suggests a patriarchal system where male family members held significant authority over women's lives, and women could not hold political positions, serve as judges in a court of law, for example. Often they were, in most cases, they weren't even allowed to speak at the things, at the assemblies. They really needed men to represent them in legal matters and had restricted rights to property and inheritance. Women's honor was also tied to their purity before marriage, and it was the responsibility of the father or of the guardian to protect it. And this placed a significant burden on women, restricted their freedom of action. Additionally, there are also double standards regarding sexual activity because men, they could engage in extramarital affairs. Polygamy was also something to be found in this society, and there were minimal consequences. On the other hand, women faced severe social repercussions. That doesn't mean that women were completely powerless. Norse law acknowledged at least their presence in society and sought to ensure their welfare, at least in certain circumstances. For example, married and widowed women had the right to inherit and own property, as well as to decide where they lived. Sometimes they could also participate in assemblies. That would have happened especially if you were a widow or if you did not have any male relatives or guardians. So this suggests that, at least to a certain extent, Norse society recognized women's ability to manage their own affairs and contribute to public life, to social life, particularly in the absence of men. Sometimes we also find sources that criticize the legal system's failure to protect women. In Fossbreda saga, for example, where we have a widow like Grima who resorts to magic to protect her daughter from an unwanted suitor. And this would emphasize the limitation of legal recourse for women facing harassment or exploitation. And speaking of sorcery, this is something that you often find in old Icelandic sagas, this idea of a woman, of the women taking up the role of prophetesses or sorceresses. It was one efficient way to gain some sort of power and influence. It was a very ambiguous position. It was not really regarded that highly by society. But it was necessary as well. So, for example, if your region was experiencing some kind of severe famine or some other problems, you would have resorted to a prophetess or a sorceress, as well as in feuding cases, for example, that also happens. If you want the very vivid description of such a case, such a prophetess, you should read the saga of Eric the Red, where you have the most detailed description of such a role, the prophetess Thorbjörg Litlvolva. It's not all of it is historically accurate. We're talking about saga from the 13th century, but you're going to find a lot of interesting details there about the position of these women in society when they take up the role of prophetesses or sorceresses. And then you also have queens and royal women. Generally, in the sagas at least, they're presented quite problematically, often negatively, and this again would suggest the need to reinforce these patriarchal patterns. So it would not have been that socially acceptable for a woman to gain that much power. We have, for example, Queen Gunhildr. She was the wife of King Eric Bloodaxe, and she is portrayed as actively participating in statecraft. She is described as a very shrewd political operator, much more ruthless than her husband in some instances, and instrumental in maintaining their grip on power. The sagas often cast her in negative light, attributing her with characteristics such as sorcery and nymphomania. However, they also portray her as a complex and capable character. Queen mothers also seem to play an important part. Some of them would have had a long-lasting influence. For example, Osta, who was the mother of King Olavur, portrayed as an ambitious woman acting on her son's behalf, actively shaping his political career, orchestrating lavish feasts as well to bolster his image and attract political allies. So queen mothers would have had their own retinues. They could also participate in politics quite actively, so both formally and behind the scenes, and their position was definitely much more secure than that of royal wives, as they could not be sidelined through divorce or remarriage. We do, in other words, have women, particularly those from influential families, that could have been used as political pawns to forge alliances and secure power. For example, Ostrid, the sister of King Olavur, refused to marry beneath her station, leveraging her refusal to elevate her future husband's status and secure advantages for herself and her family. Like I said, widows also had quite the interesting position, especially the wealthy ones. They could inherit their husband's property and also use these economic resources to gain a degree of political leverage. They could also participate in assemblies. They managed their own estates and even funded political campaigns. We have the example of Unnr, the deep-minded, a widowed war king's wife. As a prime example, she fled Scotland with her followers and settled in Iceland. She's one of the first settlers in Iceland, and she distributed land there, arranged marriages, effectively acting as a ruler in her own right. Even without formal political titles, women could exert influence through their, let's say, social connections, abilities, intelligence, or wisdoms. They could have served as advisors for their husbands, often offering counsel and warnings. We have here the example of Jorun in Laxdöla saga, using her understanding of local politics to prevent her husband from engaging in ill-advised feuds. A more controversial aspect of women's influence involved egging on men, convincing them to engage in dangerous actions, particularly acts of violence and revenge. And this is quite the stereotypical image that you can find in the Icelandic sagas, the woman as a wetter. This can also be considered as some sort of female agency. You basically used the resources that were available to you in the given context. However, it can also be argued that the image perpetuated a cycle of violence and unfairly burdened women with their responsibility for the bloodshed caused by men. Well, in conclusion, formal political power in Viking Age Scandinavia largely rested with men. Nevertheless, women, particularly those of higher status, did find some ways to exert influence and participate in political life because they leveraged their social connections, economic resources, and intelligence in order to navigate the existing power structures and sometimes defy them. The next stereotype refers to what the Vikings looked like. The Vikings, again, presented as very uncivilized and unkempt and not caring about hygiene. Well, yeah, sure. The Vikings who arrived on foreign shores might have appeared unkempt due to their journey's demands. However, evidence suggests that they were relatively clean at home in Scandinavia and in their colonies abroad. Then again, it depends on the source you're referring to. If you take into account Ibn Fadlan's stories, Ibn Fadlan being an Arab chronicler who documented the Rus. The Rus were, well, kind of like an amalgamation of peoples in Eastern Europe. There would have been Scandinavians, but there would have also been Balts and Finns and Bulgars and Slavs and many other people. So it was a very complex group, but the Scandinavian element was present. At any rate, when he encounters the Norse, he is actually disgusted by them. So at least by his standards of a Muslim Arab, they would have been very filthy creatures. He actually describes them as such, the filthiest creatures of God. He describes using all of them using the same wash basin and just passing it on from one another, which yeah, he finds abominable. But then again, we have plenty of sources suggesting that they actually cared a lot about their hygiene. The Old Norse Icelandic word for Saturday is laugardagur, which means the bath day. And this would suggest that people in medieval Scandinavia bathed at least once a week. We also have the poem Hovamol, the sayings of the High One, which is the second poem of the collection known as the Poetic Edda. It is the longest poem as well. It is filled with gnomic, so wisdom literature as well, so definitely something to look out for. And we have stanza number 4, which advises us to wash your hands, comb your head. And then stanza 61 suggests a guest will want for little if he is well looked after, a towel clean and fresh, and a warm invitation. So at least according to this poem, a social norm would have involved hygiene as well. In Erbiga Saga, you find the reference that women would bathe the men, children, and themselves. The archaeological evidence also supports this idea that Vikings were concerned with personal hygienes because excavations have unearthed a lot of objects such as ear spoons to remove earwax, as well as a lot of combs made of antler and bone to groom hair and, well, potentially to remove lice and other undesired creatures on your body. Washing bowls, tweezers, and toothpicks are also objects that form part of the archaeological record. And lately, especially in particular referring to combs, a lot of studies have been made. Combs are a very interesting topic, also because when analyzing combs using the newest techniques, you can also say a lot about trading patterns and about where materials originated and how people engage with one another. So this is definitely a very fascinating topic, and I think on most archaeological sites you would find a suitable reservoir of Viking combs. So this would enforce the idea that they actually cared a lot about about what they looked like. We also have some written sources um, uh, complaining about, for example, Anglo-Saxons having adopted the Viking fashion or something like that. So essentially, that Anglo-Saxons were themselves to be found guilty because they adopted Viking fashion. This is also something very interesting in order to enforce this idea of Vikings being very preoccupied with their fashion as well, so not only with hygiene. And speaking of fashion, we also have a source describing Vikings, or at least from the town of Heatherbu, that would be the southernmost Viking town, important trade town, nowadays located in northern Germany. Close to Schleswig. We have here a reference by a Jewish merchant from Tortosa, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, and he speaks of the Norse using some kind of artificial eye makeup to enhance their eyes' beauty. So, if we corroborate all this evidence that we have, we can definitely come to the conclusion that they were preoccupied with their own hygiene. However, that does not mean that they were very healthy. This is something that you hear nowadays, but not only in reference with the Vikings, but generally with ancient and medieval peoples. The fact that they would have been healthier, they would have lived and especially eaten much healthier than we do nowadays. Well, this is, let's say, partially true. So it is true that in comparison to many other peoples living in Europe on the continent, Vikings would have had a much more balanced diet. They would have had much more protein intake. Just think about the quantity of fish they would have eaten and so on. So definitely from this point of view, they would have led a much healthier life. But and also, if you compare the situation in the Viking Age and what we eat nowadays, you can figure out a couple of more advantages, such as the fact that sugar intake would have also been very low in comparison to what we're eating today, and they didn't have processed food for obvious reasons. However, this does not mean that they were very healthy. They had a major source of infestation, and that was undercooked food. Interesting research has been done on the rubbish of people, so rubbish and latrines and so on, is something very valuable for archaeologists. There is even a piece of turd that is a very important archaeological source for figuring out how healthy they were, and the conclusion is very much in the line of that they were suffering from all kinds of infestations with parasites. They were plagued by intestinal parasites, which would have been very, very unpleasant. And yeah, the newest research actually shows that they would have suffered from many other diseases, some of them very contagious, such as smallpox. So even strains of smallpox have been confirmed in the analysis of skeletal remains. So to put it in a nutshell, yes, they would have had quite a balanced diet, at least in comparison to many others of their time. But on the other hand, we should also think about the way the food was prepared. And the main way the food was prepared, again, contrary to popular belief that they used to grill and roast everything, actually the most popular way to prepare food was by boiling it. And when boiling it, well, sometimes, I don't know, you have to do things in a hurry, and you also have a lot of guests if you organize a feast, and so on. Many reasons for that, but at any rate, they would have undercooked their food, and undercooked food hides quite a lot of danger. Another common misconception, which is really a silly one, is that Vikings drank from skulls. This belief is very deeply entrenched, and it stems from the 17th century, actually. Unlike the blood eagle, which remains an enigma for the reasons I just presented to you, the skull cup is definitely quite clearly a misconception. It stems from a mistranslation by the Danish scholar Ole Worm. So Ole Worm wrote a Latin translation in 1636 of the skaldic poem Krokumol, better known as The Last Words of Ragnar Lothbrok. And he introduced the skull cup myth through a misinterpretation of a kenning. A kenning being this type of very complex poetic metaphor, very common in skaldic verse. We are dealing with the phrase, the curved branches of the skull. And this would have been intended to describe the shape and material of drinking horns. It was mistakenly rendered as referring to cups actually crafted from human skulls. The mistranslation, however, rapidly gained traction and was propagated through subsequent translations and literary works, solidifying the image of Vikings as barbaric and bloodthirsty. And the depiction of Vikings, feasting on ale from the skulls of their fallen foes, became a staple of Viking imagery, appearing everywhere in art, literature, and popular culture, further cementing the inaccurate notion in the public imagination. Archaeological findings definitely contradict the skull cup myth. Viking Age drinking vessels predominantly consist of wooden cups, but also metal goblets, and also of horns, and there is no archaeological evidence whatsoever to support the use of human skulls as drinking vessels with the Vikings, because that does not mean that there were not cases where people actually did that. For example, we have a source, the history of the Longobards, written by Paul the Deacon, and here he mentions that Alboin, the king of the Lombards, killed the king of the Gepids, which we're dealing with two Germanic tribes, very much at each other's throat, and then Alboin turned the defeated king's skull into a goblet. The author then tells us that his daughter Rosamund became his, he says bed warmer, so essentially wife, and later she had Alboin murdered after he made her have a drink from her father's skull. So this would be one example from the Germanic world, but then again we have a Christian source of Paul the Deacon, so we can wonder whether this was true or not. We also have Herodotus speaking of the Scythians who did that, and we also have some archaeological evidence with reference to people living in Britain, but a long time ago. We're talking about 11,000 years ago. And the archaeological evidence would suggest that this would have been a practice, at least in this particular case, associated with cannibalism as well. And speaking of myths, inevitably we also come to the horned helmets, although I think, yeah, anyone pretty much knows by now that this was a misconception as well. However, I do want to say a couple of words about this as well and how it spread. The origins are to be found, as usual, in 19th century Romanticism. The Romantic period, like I said, had a fascination with the perceived wild and irrational nature of the Germanic past. And we have a lot of artists, such as Gustav Malmström, who illustrated Esaias Tegner's epic poem, for example, Fritjof Saga, in the 1820s, depicting Vikings with horned helmets, likely drawing inspiration from some ancient ceremonial headgear or also fantastical medieval knightly attire. And speaking about ceremonial headgear, we actually do have some horned helmets, but they are from the Bronze Age. These ones you can find here from Växjö, from Denmark, and they would have been used in some sort of ceremonial ritual, but definitely not in war. Then you have costume designer Carl Emil Doppler further solidifying the horned helmet stereotype in 1876 when he created helmets with horns for the festival production of the opera Nibelungenring, The Ring of the Nibelungs by Richard Wagner. And this association with Wagner's romanticized interpretation of Norse mythology cemented the image in the public imagination. And then throughout the 20th century, you have this helmet becoming a staple in pretty much everything associated with the Vikings, in children's books and illustrations, advertisements, films, television, and so on. So really a constant exposure. Archaeological evidence, well, totally refutes the horned helmets, at least in the Viking Age and used in war. There have been a couple of Viking Age pieces of helmets recovered. The most well-preserved one is the Hjermundbu helmet discovered in Norway, and it's just a very regular helmet. It doesn't have any indications of protrusions, horns of the kind. So you need to think that horned helmets would have been very, very impractical and dangerous for warriors, and definitely been cumbersome on crowded ships, and could easily snag on branches during land battles. So definitely quite a myth. But the lifespan of this myth is also a testament to the power of artistic interpretation and the popular culture shaping historical perceptions. Moving on with my favorite, the topic of Viking DNA. The topic of Viking DNA, which has been quite at the center of attention when discussing ancestry lately, and this has to do with the emergence of all kinds of companies, genetic testing companies, promising you that they're going to discover the truth about your origins. Well, first of all, genetics can indeed be very, very useful. It tells you quite a bit about the movement of peoples, contacts between them, and, for example, scientists were able to discover that families of Scandinavians were buried together when they went raiding. However, this doesn't really tell much about how they would have identified themselves or how they would have been seen in the communities. Quite the contrary, we do have some examples as well from the British Isles, where graves that seem very, very Viking, so they have objects traditionally associated with Viking culture. Upon genetic testing, it was discovered that these people didn't actually stem from Scandinavia, but from the British Isles themselves. But they apparently identified themselves as Viking warriors. There is also a recent study investigating how gene flow from various regions shaped the genetic landscape of Scandinavia over the past 2,000 years. Essentially, the researchers analyzed data from about 300 ancient genomes spanning the Roman Iron Age to the present day, and they also examined data from 16,000 modern Scandinavians to understand contemporary genetic patterns, and they combined new whole genome sequence data from 48 ancient individuals with previously published data from 250 ancient individuals, including additional sequence depth from a couple of more burials, such as from the Swedish town of Sigtuna. Among the findings, so for example, that British-Irish ancestry became widespread in Scandinavia from the Viking period onwards, or that Eastern Baltic ancestry is more localized on the island of Gotland and central Sweden, or that the north-south difference or genetic decline observed in modern Scandinavians with greater genetic distance from southern populations in the north likely existed in the Viking Age and possibly earlier, and it is mainly attributed to differential levels of Uralic ancestry. All of this essentially relies on the distribution of haplogroups. So a haplogroup would be a genetic population group of people who share a common ancestor on the patrilineal, on the matrilineal line. So definitely you can do a lot of interesting things with DNA, especially in tracing the movements of people. But what DNA analysis doesn't really tell you is if you're really linked to someone who lived like 1,000 years ago. What I mean by this, so from the year 1000 to today, we have about 35 generations, so to speak. By the 35th generation, you would have something like a couple of billion ancestors. Well, in reality, you don't really have billions of unique ancestors, and the reason for that is the so-called pedigree collapse. This means that your ancestors intermarried, many of them appearing multiple times in your family tree. And this happens because historically people lived in small communities and they married within limited groups, and cousins used to marry quite often, even first degree cousins. That would have reduced the number of unique ancestors. So roughly speaking, you would have a couple of thousands of ancestors. By the year 1000, that's still a lot of people. So when a test tells you that you are 15% Viking, this doesn't really tell you that you are a Viking in any meaningful sense. First and foremost, because the way these modern companies work is by comparing your DNA with the DNA of the people, the modern humans, the people who are still alive in their databases. So this basically shows you that there is a statistical probability that you share some common ancestors with a bunch of people living in Scandinavia nowadays. And this is quite a bit of an oversimplification. The truth is that you're a bit of everything. Ancestry is very, very messy. We come from all over the place. So if you're white, at least, yeah, there is a very high chance that you are a bit Norse, and that you're a bit Anglo-Saxon, and that you're a bit Celt, or whatever you want, and a little bit of Charlemagne. So DNA can definitely help us understand patterns of migration, but the further back in time you go, the dimmer the past becomes. And think about the fact that you have two chunks of your DNA, which is the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, making up just a little bit part of the genome, and then the rest of it comes from this pick and mix from all the rest of your ancestors. And with each subsequent generation, the contribution from an individual to your lineage becomes less. And this has been described by researchers as homeopathic delusion. So delusion in the sense that, well, half of your genome comes from your mother, half from your father, a quarter from each of your grandparents. But because DNA is shuffled every time a sperm or an egg is made, it doesn't really keep halving perfectly as you go up your family tree. So you should have quite a lot of ancestors, but their genetic contribution to you is not equal. So before long, you will find ancestors from whom you bear no DNA. So they are your family, essentially, your blood, but their genes have been diluted so much that they are no longer part of your bloodline. What I'm trying to tell you is that this is really, really a messy story. Genetics is messy, ancestry is messy. It can also be powerful, but don't expect some big history, secret history to be revealed by a DNA analysis. So if you want to spend your cash on something like this, feel free to do it, although I wouldn't do it because of the fact that it is quite unethical. You are essentially sharing what is most intimate about you to a private company, so I would definitely not do it. But yeah, like I said, maybe you are a bit Viking. It's perfectly acceptable. Definitely for each pair of people you take, you are eventually, at some point, the further you go into the past, you are going to find a common ancestor. That's inevitable. But then again, in matters of identity, DNA doesn't really tell you that much. It doesn't tell you. It tells you little about the language you speak, for example, your cultural background, the collective memories of your group. Identity is really a complex process. It can't be reduced to DNA. If it's reduced to DNA, then we are going to fall into very peculiar and potentially dangerous ideology, also with some roots in the past, in the 19th century, when blood was considered as being your identity. So essentially, you're replacing DNA with blood, which leads to, like I said, to very dangerous assumptions that somehow there is a clear-cut distinction between peoples based on the DNA, and so on. It can be instrumented, misused, and instrumented politically as well in very nefarious purposes. So be careful with that. And I told you I have a bonus, and my bonus is on the topic mythology. Because today is the winter solstice and because we're celebrating Christmas in a couple of days, I want to address the issue of Odin, often being said to have been the ancestor of Santa Claus for some reason. Uh, that is not really the case. The image is also skewed because Odin, if you look at the sources, isn't really depicted as Santa Claus at all. He is usually depicted as wearing blue, first and foremost, or grey. And in some of the sources, I think it was in Volsunga Saga, he's also depicted as wearing a spotted cloak. There have been attempts to associate the 8 reindeer of Santa Claus with the horse Sleipnir, Odin's horse with 8 legs. I don't know where this association comes from, but it doesn't really make any sense at all. 8 reindeer and an 8-legged horse. I don't really see the resemblance. At any rate, Odin is not really Santa Claus. If you look at his personality, he is probably the most selfish, mischievous god in Norse mythology. He doesn't really give gifts to people. When he does that, though, sometimes he offers weapons. That is true. But when he does that, he has a very clear purpose in his mind, which is to harvest warriors, the best warriors for his army. If you read the Volsunga Saga, for example, he offers this very powerful weapon to the hero Sigmund. Sigmund is the only one able to pull this sword out of a tree. But then again, he is killed by this very weapon, by by Odin, because Odin really wants him for his army. He is really dominated by his anxieties related to Ragnarok and the fact that the prophetess has told him that he's going to be swallowed by the wolf Fenrir, among other things, this whole apocalyptic event. And his main purpose is to gather the best of warriors in this great army called the Einherjar in Valhall. So whenever he offers gifts, especially to very powerful warriors, it is because he is interested in achieving something himself. So he is not the selfless. Generous Santa Claus we know from folklore. No, no way. However, we do have an interesting name for Odin. By the way, Odin has, I think, more than 200 names. One of these names is Jolnir. And Jolnir comes from the word Jol, Yule, and nowadays it is still used in the Scandinavian languages to refer to the celebration on the winter solstice. That's why we say Good Yule, for example. So Merry Christmas in Scandinavia. So there would have been a celebration. Although the exact date of the celebration is a bit of a conundrum, because apparently the main celebration would have been sometime in mid-January and not necessarily on the winter solstice. At any rate, if you want to know more about that, you can watch my lecture on exactly this topic, the chronology and historical sources about the midwinter celebrations with the Norse. Well, we do have this name appearing in some sources, such as the saga of Håkon the Good, as well as in an older poem called the Holigatal. So he might have had some sort of relationship to the celebration. There is a mention in the saga of Håkon the Good that there was a toast addressed to the gods, and one of these gods is Odin. But other than that, there isn't really much to draw on here. Santa Claus, as we know him nowadays, can be traced back to Saint Nicholas. So it is actually Christian folklore. It is believed that Saint Nicholas was born sometime around 280 in Mira, that would be in modern day Turkey, and he was much admired for his piety and kindness, became the subject of many legends, and it is said that he gave away all of his inherited wealth and traveled the countryside, helping the poor and the sick. And apparently the name Santa Claus most likely evolved from the Dutch nickname Sinterklaas, which is a shortened form of Saint Nicholas, Saint Nicolaas. And then you also have some authors, American authors, with a contribution to popularizing the image of Santa Claus. For example, you have Washington Irving, who did that. He referred to St. Nicholas as the patron saint of New York in his book, The History of New York. And as his prominence grew, he was described as everything from a three-cornered hat, red waistcoat, and yellow stockings, to a man wearing this broad-brimmed hat. So there you go. No Santa Claus in Norse mythology, unfortunately. To conclude, we can notice here that the image of the Vikings has undergone significant transformations over the centuries, shaped by a complex interplay of historical accounts, cultural movements, and popular media. So first and foremost, we have the early Christian and also Muslim sources, primarily focused on Viking raids, painting a negative picture, predominantly depicting them as brutal, savage, pagan barbarians. And these accounts, understandably biased by the trauma of Viking attacks, contributed to a well-lasting stereotype that persisted for centuries. Then the 18th century saw a shift in perception as the Romantic movement emerged, celebrating the irrational and the sublime, and also finding inspiration in the Germanic past. Vikings were recast as these noble savages, embodying the antithesis of the Greco-Roman values and representing a primitive people untainted by civilization. The 19th century witnessed a surge of interest in Vikings and Norse mythology, fueled by national romanticism and a fascination with Germanic roots of European culture. And we have works both from the Scandinavian area, but also from the continental area, featuring all kinds of myths, such as the horned helmets, romanticizing again the Viking image and emphasizing a shared Norse culture rather than regional differences. This era also saw the emergence of racial theories that idealized the Norse as a superior Aryan race, contributing to a very, very distorted view of Viking homogeneity and racial purity. The 20th century saw the Vikings making their debut on the silver screen, often perpetuating again the barbarian image in films like The Viking from 1928 or Vikings from 1958. These films were commercially successful, but they reinforced stereotypes of Vikings as violent, impulsive, and pleasure seeking heathens. In the mid 20th century, we do have a revisionist approach, focusing on their achievements in trade and exploration and craftsmanship, especially in academia, where scholars began to challenge the simplistic barbarian image, highlighting the complexity of Viking society and culture. That was not without critique of this revisionist view, because that could also mean downplaying the brutality of the raids and their impact on European history. Popular culture continues to be captivated by the Vikings, with the famous television series as well as numerous video games often drawing on both the romanticized and barbaric elements of their image. So the image of the Vikings has evolved from these fearsome raiders to noble savages, idealized racial icons, and more recently, complex figures whose history encompasses both violence and cultural achievement. And our understanding of the Vikings continued to be refined with each new archaeological discovery and new scholarly interpretation, meant to challenge established narratives and shed light on the nuances, complexity of their lives and legacy. Thank you very much for listening or watching this presentation. I also have a couple of videos where I detailed many of the things I presented here. So I kindly ask you to check out my YouTube channel as well, Shield of Skuld, and find out more about the Vikings there. Thank you very much, and I really hope this was useful. Otherwise, God Jul, have a merry Yuletide, and all the best.